Alrighty. Looks like that's it for the Legion figures. Let's just take a look if there's any store exclusives. Ah, Megatronus. Yes, I didn't seem to see him on store shelves. Maybe he's been imported to Australia? Just gotta take a look at that. Let's see, where is he?
Now facing a very grown-up problem, filing for bankruptcy and $5 billion in long-term debt as foot traffic slows down in its nearly 900 U.S. stores. The bankruptcy filing comes as online giant Amazon continues its retail conquest, beating out Toys R Us, Walmart, Target, and dollar stores to become the top toy seller in the U.S.
Legends completionism can often be difficult, although let's face it, completionism of anything can often be difficult. Have you tried collecting all 800 and something Pokemon? I don't think many people have, and hey, Game Freak just decided to make that decision for everyone. F you, Game Freak! There's just so many weird decisions when it comes to releasing Transformers toys and weird variants and all that stuff, so it makes the entire collecting system very messy.
Oh yeah, sure, and let's just not release Last Night Hot Rod in Australia and both the Deluxe and Legion version. Yeah, that's a great idea!
By all accounts, given Megatronus' status as the Season 1 villain after Steeljaw, he should have gotten a mainline release, but for some bizarre reason, he just straight up didn't. When Toys R Us went under, I pretty much gave up hope and thought I'll just get it at the end when I'm just trying to get the last few of them. However, there was a fateful day where I was browsing eBay and suddenly I came across a Takara 4-pack featuring Megatronus, Strongarm, Bumblebee, and Sideswipe. And it was pretty damn well priced too, $50 with free shipping. That, if you consider that most mainline Legion figures are $10 each, and there's an extra $2.50 for each of the paint applications that they add, yeah, that's hella worth it. Of course I jumped on that at the first chance I got. But I suppose I have to ask, is it truly worth owning this 4-pack if you already own 3 of the figures out of it? Well, to answer that, greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to the Transformers Adventure Bumblebee Team vs Megatronus 4-pack. I might be the only one here who thinks this, but I honestly believe that Robots in Disguise 2015 was the pinnacle of Legion-class engineering. The articulation and engineering wasn't anything crazy, but it absolutely nailed the screen accuracy in almost every instance. Screen accuracy isn't a positive in itself, but in the case of the inventive designs of the show, it definitely was a positive to follow it closely. As cool as the Prime designs were, I feel that the aesthetic truly came to prominence in Robots in Disguise. They were able to come up with so many unique designs once they weren't held back by the budget of designing the full environments, relying instead on a healthy dose of 2D backdrops. Whether you like the show or not, we got some great characters from it. So before we get onto the main reason why I purchased this set, how do the other members end up? Hell, I'll go one step further. So I don't have to review them at a later date, I'm going to see how they compare to the original Hasbro releases. Modern problems require modern solutions. So I suppose, given that he's the most popular of the set with the little kiddlywinks, the best place to start would be Bumblebee. Bumblebee transforms into the sort of futuristic car that almost looks like a space Camaro, but doesn't quite. Because a bunch of people only know him as a Camaro from the movies, and is supposed to be the cool kid for kids to look up to, so I guess that's what he is now. Now, I do think this design overall looks nice. There's loads of ridges and angles that bring the design to life. He's got a mean bumper accented by the awesome silver and blue paint. The bonnet is excellently covered in black paint to highlight the vents at the top. They've even gone to the trouble of painting the mirrors on the side. Very nice attention to detail. One question about all this extra paint though. Where are the windows? There's no denying that the paint budget is far higher than on the original, but for some reason the windows haven't been painted at all. I mean, it's fine though, it's not like the Hasbro one had any paint up, so wait! This decision is quite baffling considering Takara usually prefers to make the paint job better overall. Missing key details like this isn't very becoming of them. Well, at least the paint is clean, right? Well, for the most part it is. Every paint application is done with exceptional care, except for the sides. I don't know why, but these are done incredibly messily. It's especially bad on the slot where the app code used to be. Oh, right, I should probably explain what the app code is. On all retail Robots in Disguise toys, a small part of the body was dedicated to a code that you could photograph in a phone application in order to access characters and such. There were a few cases where you could remove them and they wouldn't impact the overall design, but for the most part they were an eyesore and required repro labels to make them look better. Takara, however, has given its customers the option to add them or not, at least in this instance. You get a sticker sheet with these codes, which are of course not compatible with the Western version of the app, and are only compatible with the Japanese one. They've also gone to the trouble of properly painting a section where the code would have been, or at least it would have been proper if it weren't the messiest paint app on the whole set. Kudos for trying to go the extra mile, but they really should have seen this through properly. Now moving on, I have somewhat of a connection to the original Hasbro Legion Strongarm release. She's one of my favorites because as I was getting back into Transformers, she was one of the first figures I got, along with Optimus Prime. Then that led to me ordering Thrilling 30 Springer off TF Source, and the rest is history. Personal bias aside though, the base figure is really good. Of course, most Legion figures are determined to be good or bad depending on their robot mode, but in vehicle mode we basically have the same deal as we did with Bumblebee, only with a little more class. Right off the bat, yes, the side windows are again unfortunately not painted. Considering this is meant to be a Takara release, having 2 for 2 is actually quite annoying. That being said, holy shit, this metallic blue is amazing! Instead of being cast in primarily blue plastic with added white paint, we now have the reverse with white plastic and blue paint, and the paint in question shines with gusto. The grille section at the front adds a metric ton of detail which wasn't present on the original, right down to the turquoise headlights, a colour which, by the way, appears nowhere else in the vehicle mode. The added stripe in the middle not only doubles down on accuracy, but also breaks up the quite boring hood in general. The headlight section has been shortened a bit, and although I do prefer the wider lights seen on the original release, the metallic paint blows the original colours out of the water. One of the elements I find the most exciting would have to be the massive gunmetal stripe that they've coated the entire bottom section with. Without fail, it stretches around the entire vehicle, uninterrupted. The fact that it's slightly different to the black wheels helps define it even more. You'll also notice that neither of these have any outcoats. Well, in this case, Strongarm was molded and painted in such a way that you could remove it without damaging the sculpt, and the paint still works properly too. If I had to discuss any complaints, there would only be 2, and they're shared between both versions. I would have liked to have seen some black paint on the back window as well, as it is sculpted there but it's never utilized. The original never painted it either though. The other issue would have to be the slightly hollow back section, but to be honest, considering the budget, you'd have to be pretty stupid to try and disregard the entire figure for that. I mean, yeah, maybe the mirrors could have been painted, especially on a Takara budget, but the base mold is still great regardless, so who cares? Moving on to Sideswipe, you can see the figure with the least amount of changes in comparison to his Hasbro counterpart, or at least I think he is. I don't have Hasbro Megatronus for obvious reasons, so I can't be 100% sure. In vehicle mode, you could pretty much count the changes on one hand. Lighter, shinier plastic, a darker gunmetal for the windows, and a couple of extra splotches on the front section. Yes, the changes are negligible, but to be honest, it's enough to get an edge over the Hasbro version. And regardless, this is a pretty sweet alt mode. All the extra angles and sharp edges really bring this alt mode to life. It looks like he's stepped out of Blade Runner, and yes, I will continue to make the cyberpunk comparisons until I die. Come at me! In general, this alt mode acts more as an approximation of the on-screen model than a faithful representation, but to be honest, I don't really mind. And yes, he could use way more black to differentiate the colors, but what we have here is still really nice. That being said, he does have a few issues. They are a little difficult to notice, but they are there. For starters, both figures are molded incredibly softly towards the back, so a lot of the angular detail ends up looking fuzzy. It's made even more apparent with the shinier plastic, although I do prefer said plastic overall. It's just unfortunate that the sculpt work betrays it. Furthermore, these feet at the top are quite obnoxious. I get that they have to become the feet in robot mode, but they end up ruining the cohesion of the alt mode quite a bit. In fact, it's slightly worse on the Takara version because they've coated the entire piece as opposed to just a small part of it, so the outlining of the back section goes whack. Maybe it would have looked a bit better if they'd added some extra black paint to the rest of the figure, which brings me to the main issue. This guy has a little more paint than his Hasbro counterpart, but when you consider the massive changes the others went through, this just seems a bit lazy. They didn't pick out the spikes on the side, or the tail lights, or even the mirrors. It's categorically better than the Hasbro release, but I feel they could have taken this to the next level, just with an extra dab here and there. Finally, you're left with the recess where the app code was supposed to go. This is one of the cases where they integrated the code into the actual sculpting, and as such, the lack of it looks incredibly odd. Honestly, this whole decision was poorly thought out, especially since the app is either already defunct or soon will be. Still, it's a good design anyway. It may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but for what it's worth, they've done a bang-up job. And that brings us to the main reason why anyone would buy this thing, or at least the reason why I bought it. Megatronus turns into a thing. Look, I'll be honest, this isn't really the fault of the figure itself. The original alt mode is weird to say the least. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but if you dislike Cybertronian alt modes, then this really isn't going to do it for you. Fortunately, this falls more on the side of Siege than it does Revenge of the Fallen, giving us something rather solid. Overall, I do have to say I like this mode. It's definitely a tad clunkier than the Warrior counterpart, and overall I think the Bludgeon version of the base design works much better, but Megatronus' tank has some charm to it. It's weird, it's wacky, the turret has a bayonet on it for some reason. None of the paint here seems to be in service of the vehicle mode specifically, focusing on the robot mode primarily, but the byproduct of that is an interesting design overall. The turret stands out pretty well, avoiding blending into the mess of plastic below, through the use of a full coat of gunmetal, and the silver and purple paint managed to break it up successfully. You even get some half-decent posing with the use of a hinge and a swivel, giving this mode technically more articulation than the full-sized version. The feet and knee spikes on the treads are pretty obvious feet and knee spikes, but their paint fortunately breaks up the monotony just enough to avoid boredom. The head is unfortunately on full show, but thankfully you won't notice it from most angles. The only thing I can really criticize would have to be the lack of upward angles on the fronts of the treads. I understand that at such a scale some things had to be sacrificed, but this was a staple design choice of the original Warrior figure. To see a Megatronus without it is most certainly a tragedy. Due to the nature of the size class, these guys are most certainly not to scale, but fortunately they don't feel too tiny for what you're paying for. There is no denying that this size class, like everything else, has gotten smaller over the years, but since Revenge of the Fallen, the size class has remained pretty consistent. So given that these are a group of 4 Legion figures, of course their transformations are varied, and surprisingly, the ones that you would think would be the simplest to do actually end up being the hardest, and the ones that end up being the hardest end up being the simplest. Case in point, Bumblebee. You'd think a design like this would be fairly simple, but they've gone through a lot of effort into making this a very complex transformation scheme. And I don't think it was worth it. He comes out pretty damn messy. Not as messy as some of the Terracons I've just reviewed, but still pretty damn messy. First thing you want to do is bring the arms out like so, and it is awfully tight for the kind of figure we're dealing with here. Probably shouldn't have been that tight, but whatever. You then separate this entire section out like that, which will allow you to access the rest of the parts. From here, you come under here and get the feet out, and then you can separate the legs. Come to the back here and bring the head up, like so. Come over here, and that will allow you to open up that section. And this is one of the most annoying parts of the transformation. Like a needle, you've got to thread the head right through that hole over there, and then that section will clip onto the back there. Like so. That did not need to be that complicated. It's bloody ridiculous. Last thing you want to do is reposition the arms a bit forward. Yeah, overcomplicated, pretty messy, and ultimately not really worth it, I think. Strongarm, on the other hand, is an example of simple but effective transformation systems. Really, this was a great toy to get back into when I was first collecting Transformers after all those years of Warhammer. So the first thing you want to do is come over here and bring the arms out like that. They're sort of pegged in there and they'll just slot out. That will give you enough clearance to untab the legs and fold them out like that. You don't want to just grab them and yank them out like so. You want to actually unslot them because of the way they're slotted together. You then come over to the shoulders and bring them down and rotate them 90 degrees. They're on ball joints, so it's pretty easy. Now from here, what the instructions tell you to do and what all the stock photography tells you to do is to bring these sections out like so. However, I usually prefer to bring them inside like so. It's just far cleaner on the overall design, and as such, that's what you're going to see for the rest of the review. And yeah, that's an amazing robot mode, not gonna lie. Sideswipe is pretty stock standard, one of the most boring transformations I've covered. It's the whole legs out, hood down, basically a Micromaster transformation. Yeah, legs out, feet up, bring this hood section down like so, and hooray, out come the arms. Whoop-de-doo! Again, you don't want to yank the legs out like that, you want to slot them out, in the opposite direction to Strongarm, that is. But, yeah, it's a very nice robot mode, not gonna lie, but the transformation was pretty damn boring. Now, Megatronus is interesting. They didn't try to replicate his larger figure at all. They went for a very different and unique style of transformation. Of course, they couldn't have done the full warrior figure at this small scale, but I feel what they've done here is a little bit disappointing just because of the end result. It's fine to transform on its own, though. What you want to do here is come to the side and just push this shoulder section out a little bit, which will allow the arm to pop out, and as a result, because of the way you're putting pressure on it, the foot should pop out like that. Same thing on this side. That will allow you to bring the feet down, at which point what you want to do is rotate them like so, and you rotate the waist 180 degrees. You bring the arms all the way out like so, and then use the ball joints to bring them all the way down. Overall, a very nice robot mode. Now, there is optional parts forming to get a better look for him. You can leave the turret on there as kibble, but what the instructions actually tell you to do is to take it off like that, and peg it into the side of the arm. It can also peg into the hands there, but of course it's best to use it in the fusion cannon mounting method. And yeah, and the end result is, it's alright. It's not the best ever, but it's an okay representation of this character. So as time goes by and as Transformers aesthetics have moved away from the overcomplicated messes of the movieverse and moved to the more simplified ones of the Last Knight, Robots in Disguise 2015 and the Bumblebee movie within the Legions line, it's become a lot easier to replicate these designs in smaller toy form. Yet, for some reason, Bumblebee overcomplicated things and ends up looking pretty bloody messy. Whether you're dealing with the original or the Takara version, this design isn't good. Not only does it fail to capture the design properly, a feat which even toys as old as Cybertron and the first movie were able to do, but it's just overall a messy figure. The engineering in the chest is commendable, but the end result isn't just inaccurate, it's downright ugly. In comparison to the original, I'm beginning to see why they omitted the extra windows, as they do clean up things a little bit more, but at the same time it's still butt ugly. I can generally forgive the messy midriff section and the wonky arms, but the positioning of the shoulders I cannot. I can't put my finger on what's wrong with them, but something is inherently off. I know many viewers will claim that I'm being too harsh, but the other figures managed to pull off their designs much better through the use of fake chests, so forgiving Bumblebee for this isn't really fair. I will admit though, the legs are pretty neat, although to be fair they're the easiest part of a Legion figure to do, which makes the failure of certain figures somewhat odd. You're left with a nice helping of paint in this version too, and it makes him look much better in comparison to his Hasbro counterpart. Still, the overall picture is just messy. Once again, the Hashtag designers have decided to put less effort into Bumblebee because they know it will sell well. Instead, they can focus their efforts on other figures who actually need good toys to sell units. I'm telling you, man, I'm seeing a pattern here. Might be a conspiracy hypothesis, but it's becoming a lot clearer. The articulation is quite simple. You've got ball-jointed shoulders with an extra hinge and ball-jointed hips. Sadly, there's no knee bend, but considering the budget, I don't think they could have fitted one in there. Next up, we go from one of the worst of the line to pretty much one of the best. Already, the base Strongarm figure was one of the highlights of the RID Legion line, but seeing her here in fully realized colors has me all sorts of giddy. Now, I'll fully admit that I most definitely have some biases towards the original turquoise, given its importance in my collecting history, but there's no denying that what they've given us here is categorically superior. The paint on the head sculpt and chest is immaculately done, to the point where I think it's probably tapographs as opposed to traditional paint. And the paint on the shoulder pads provides an imposing silhouette, whilst still remaining quintessentially Strongarm. The arms surprisingly don't look gimped, despite the fact that they're literally formed from hollowed out vehicle mode panels, and the legs elevate a sturdy stature. Matter of fact, I genuinely prefer the way the design was handled here to the way it was handled on the Warrior version. At the very least, the kibble was handled far better. Some might complain that there's a large amount of hollowness on the legs, but 1, Legends figure, and 2, the Warrior have the exact same issue. I don't know what you were expecting, but if it was something more than this, then you might want to contact your psychiatrist. Her articulation is a little more involved than Bumblebee's. She has ball-jointed shoulders as well as an awkwardly positioned elbow that fakes it just alright, but not amazingly. The hips are also ball-jointed, and she has a nice cut in the knees that work great for posing. Yes, sometimes the backpack does get a little in the way of the shoulders, but on such a small figure it doesn't really matter. Sideswipe continues the trend of being only subtly different from his Hasbro counterpart. As a matter of fact, putting them side by side, aside from the colors, you really have to take a closer look to see the details. Overall, much like Strongarm, he's a pretty good looking robot. Part of that's the design itself, but it has to be said that they did a good job of replicating this design in Legion form. Much like Strongarm, they had to give him a mouth plate to compensate for the small size, but the head sculpt still captures the likeness quite well. Still, as per usual, it could use a lot more paint. Why it's missing touch is beyond me, especially on a Takara release. The torso is molded quite well, and fortunately we get some extra paint on the chest to help define the front bumper on this faux part. I especially like how these segments on the midriff seem to wrap around the design, separately from the rest. Nice touch. The rest of the paint is wholly identical, with gunmetal on the arms and feet. The design is overall quite aesthetically pleasing, and I may just prefer it a smidge to the Magic Square version. That's probably due to the source material though, considering Sideswipe did jack in the G1 cartoon. If I had to complain about one thing aside from the lack of extra paint, it would be the backpack, which is pulling a Scramble City front flip. It's annoying, but again, it's a Legion figure, you can't really do anything about this. Well, actually, there is one other thing. The thighs are way too long. It's a bizarre choice, and once you notice it, you can't ignore it. The articulation is precisely the same between Strongarm and Bumblebee, so going over it again seems pointless. Again, pretty solid, not really inserting the bells and whistles, but it does its job. And that brings us to the main attraction. He's fine. For all the rarity of this mold, the end result sadly isn't the pinnacle of engineering. There is plenty to like here though. For instance, the paint is done exceptionally well. The chest is brought to life with a combination of purple paint and tapographs, and you may not be able to notice it right away, but there are extra tapographs on the knees to help outline the armor plates. Most of the figure is coated in a shiny gunmetal, and the parts that aren't are already a shiny plastic anyway. He has no kibble whatsoever, provided you put the turret on the arm, and this mold is great in terms of covering up the section where the app code would be. Since they haven't molded anything in, it works seamlessly. Unfortunately, there are some issues with this design. For starters, this guy is flat as a pancake. The chest seems to be squished in terms of depth to compensate for the tank mode, and there's no definition on the shoulders to make them stand out. The face looks like it's been flattened, and honestly they should have gone for the face-plated look, because this looks pretty damn lifeless on its own, especially with the silver paint that clashes with the rest of the aesthetic. Maybe it wouldn't if there were more of the silver paint than just on the turret, or maybe if it was slightly darker, but as it stands we're bordering on levels of dull surprise here. His shoulders are also cut incredibly awkwardly. You look at the other figures and it feels natural when you attempt to pose them, even Bumblebee, but Megatronus Megatronus' shoulders seem to be detached from the rest of his body. If it was a choice between this and extra kibble, I honestly would have taken the extra kibble. His articulation is fine, but not great. You got the aforementioned wonky ball-jointed shoulders, as well as an extra hinge outwards, which surprisingly looks better than the actual shoulder. Doesn't go out that far though. He doesn't have any elbows, but he does have a waist swivel, which is pretty neat. It's made disappointing by the lack of knee bends though, since instead he just has ball joints of the hips. I'm happy for them to provide a waist swivel, especially considering it's for the transformation, but I would have much preferred a bend at the knee or an elbow bend before they gave us extras like this. In terms of size comparisons, Bumblebee and Megatronus end up feeling a little too small for the team. It is to be expected considering they're all the same size class, but it's still a smidge disappointing. But enough of that. Final scores, since I'm not sure if I recorded them in the final footage. Bumblebee is fine, but not really an upgrade over the original given some of the baffling choices in vehicle mode. Strongarm and Sideswipe are most definitely upgrades, but Sideswipe is only barely, and Strongarm wins out by virtue of being the best goddamn mold in the entire Legion lineup, and she's definitely the best of the set too. Finally, Megatronus is alright, but his alternate mode is definitely better than his robot mode. I suppose that's true of a lot of Legion figures, but even then, considering the high quality of several figures in this line, it does feel like a bit of a disappointment. Still, the set may not have succeeded in delivering a unique experience for one of the most rare figures in the size class, but at the very least the other figures in this set are very much worth it. If you absolutely need Megatronus, well, this is certainly easier than finding the Toys R Us variant. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you, if you're only getting the set for Megatronus and nothing else, it's not really worth it. Megatronus is pretty damn good, but he's certainly not the best thing since Prime Cliffjumper, and he's not the best out of the line, which I know isn't really saying much considering most figures out of the Legion lineup in Robots in Disguise were bloody brilliant, but still, he's not that amazing. I think the best way to get this set is when you're just starting out collecting the Cyberverse Legion figures. If you don't already have most of these figures, then this is the best way to get them, because you also get a very elusive figure in the mix. That being said though, if you're thinking of swapping out, I don't think that's such a bad thing anyway, because there are a lot of improvements. So yeah, they did a really good job with this set, and I can still recommend it. Maybe I'll go back and add the black paint in from the others myself at a later date, but for now, I'm pretty glad I got this set. Even if, you know, I already have most of the figures. On the topic of elusive figures, tomorrow we're continuing that trend. So tomorrow we're going over another elusive Legion figure, and seeing the other end of the spectrum. What happens when something so elusive isn't truly worth it?